All right, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the talk today. We have a very special guest, Elizabeth Saunders, who's going to be talking to us about her new book, The Insider's Game, which I have here, which I'm going to have her sign afterwards. If you haven't gotten a chance to read it, she'll give us a little introduction to the book, and hopefully that will spark some of your interest. She's a professor of political science at Columbia University and a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings Institution. Her teaching and her research focuses on domestic politics, international security, and U.S. foreign policy. She previously wrote another great book called Leaders at War, in which she started her research agenda on elite politics and its implications for international relations. She was also previously professor at Georgetown, which I'm very proud of, because one of the last things I did before I left was hire her. So I like to be like, well, I did something right while I was there. And then they, once I left, they couldn't keep her. So that's, I think there's some correlation there. She holds an AB in physics and astronomy and astrophysics from Harvard, an MPhil in international relations from the University of Cambridge, and a PhD in political science from Yale University. And one of the first things that I just brought up that I always remembered about her is that she has this science background, which is really great for the interdisciplinary nature of CSAC, has a patent in something scientific and published in the Journal of Chemical Physics, right? Which
please don't ask me any questions.
So she's not going to talk to us about that today, but just to present this sort of well-rounded intellectual view, and she'll speak for about 35 minutes, 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Oriana. Since you happen to bring this book, I'll tell you a fun fact about the relationship between these two books. So the cover of my first book, which had 3 presidential case studies of Kennedy, Johnson, and Eisenhower, I wanted to put a picture of them on the cover. And so when I went around doing my archival work, I went and tried to find every photo. There are not that many occasions where the 3 of them were together because, of course, Kennedy was shot. So one of them was Eleanor Roosevelt's funeral, and there was a giant cross in the way so you couldn't see them. So this one is Sam Rayburn's funeral, and I found this in the archives, on the campus of the University of Texas at Austin, where the LBJ library is. They have the Texas historical records. And so I found this photo, and they're sitting in the order of the coding of the book in a pew. And what you can't see is Harry Truman is sitting over here. And so I asked the press to crop him out. And so when it came, and he's not in the book, there's no Truman chapter. And so when it came time to write this book, I said, all right, I got to write about Truman. So there is actually a chapter about the Korean War in this book. So that's a fun fact. Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I want to sort of give you a sense of the overview of this book. And I won't have time to go into all the detail, but I hope that at least sparks some interest. And I want to start from, I think, a pretty uncontroversial place, which we all kind of, I think we can all agree that democratic leaders make decisions about war and peace on behalf of all of us, on behalf of voters. But I want to try to put this in context, because we also know from research on American politics and international relations that voters don't follow foreign policy issues that closely, and that they rarely vote on foreign policy. We also know that democratic leaders are unlikely to be rewarded or punished for the war outcome. So we can just ask Winston Churchill or George H.W. Bush about this. And finally, democratic leaders often initiate and continue risky wars they know that they're unlikely to win, which is not really what the voters sent them to the Capitol to do. And so in parallel to this, though, we also know that leaders often act as if public opinion really matters, and they put a lot of effort into trying to manage it. So here we have Ronald Reagan making a speech to the nation in October of 1983, following the bombing of the Marine barracks in Lebanon when US Marines were stationed in Beirut. And you may remember in December of 2009, Barack Obama made a speech at West Point, and it was nationally televised in prime time. He asked for network airtime, and he made this speech at West Point to announce the Afghan surge. And so the question is, why are leaders putting all this effort into managing public opinion if they don't necessarily, if they're aware, I mean, they're politicians, right? That the public isn't paying that much attention day to day. So the origins of this project really came from talking to colleagues who study American political behavior. Oriana asked me to talk a little bit about the origins of the project, and it became clear just informally and through conversations with them that the way that we think about democratic accountability in IR is often at odds with what our Americanist colleagues understand to be the way that issues play roles in elections. And so I began to kind of dive into this and draw on some of the theory on the American political behavior side. So thinking here of elite Q theory, which many of you may be familiar with, work of John Zoller and more recently Adam Berinsky, that the public looks to elites for cues. So we all are busy people. We all have to make sense of a complicated world. Nobody can keep up on top of every issue. IR people can't even keep up with all the different issues within IR. If you'd invited me here to give a talk about healthcare policy, I would have said, well, I would have said no. But if you'd insisted, I would have said, you're not getting your money's worth, right? We all, this is just how humans make sense of a complicated world. And I should say that elites here are those, I argue that those with access to the state's information and decision-making apparatus, and those who can serve as cue givers, not just to the public, but also to other elites. Because as I say, elites don't even keep up with every issue of the day. It's all one sort of existing answer to the puzzle of how the public doesn't pay that close attention day to day and yet can still be the source of accountability is that the public can learn what it needs to know. So there's a lot of work in both American politics and in IR that has sort of demonstrated that presented with information, the public can assimilate it and understand it and use it to kind of hold leaders accountable. And if the queuing environment is providing that information, then the public can sort of behave as if it were as well informed as elites with better access to information. At least on the American politics side, though, one feature of this, part of the way that the public can get this sort of information is through the presence or absence of elite consensus. So if all the elites that they're hearing from agree that the use of force in a particular case is the right thing to do, then they're hearing that consistent sort of elite consensus message. But in these theories, often the consensus kind of drops from the sky, right? There's no story about where it came from. There's no politics surrounding forging that consensus in the first place. And so this book is really trying to fill that gap. It's to fill in the missing role of elite politics and understand why some elites that you would not expect end up supporting the president's decision to use military force and others end up criticizing it. And that is a highly political process that we do need to understand better. And so going back to this puzzle, I argue that what's happening here is in the first instance, leaders are managing elite opinions. So here's Ronald Reagan, but here he is inside a much earlier version of the Situation Room. This picture is anachronistic in more ways than one. But here he is conferring with his advisors on the deployment to Lebanon. And then thinking about the Obama speech, this is the front row at the West Point speech. And it was very, very, very important to Obama to have all of these advisors, many of whom had very independently high profiles. So Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, next to her, Robert Gates, the Republican holdover Secretary of Defense. A little bit further down is David Petraeus, who was then riding high after the apparent success of the Iraq surge. And Obama really wanted them to be in the front row, despite the fact that they really disagreed among themselves about the Afghanistan surge. And apparently this really freaked out the Secret Service because they don't like it when the whole national security team is on one helicopter. But that's what the president wanted. And so I argue that what leaders are doing is fundamentally playing the insider's game. So the argument of this book is that elites in democracies are a distinct domestic audience that can punish or reward leaders. So none of this would be necessary to complicate the story of voter accountability. We wouldn't need to bother if we ended up with the same answer, right? If elites were just serving as kind of faithful intermediaries of elite preferences, of public preferences. But I argue that managing elite consensus is a fundamentally different political problem than placating public opinion. So I'm not arguing that the public plays no role. The public can constrain, but it's not as though leaders have to just accept what the elites think about their decision to use military force. They're politicians. They can do things. They can't automatically shape public opinion, but they can do things to try to manage the environment of elite cues, which is a fundamentally political process. And elite constraints, therefore, are different from public constraints. Among other things, they happen early and often, right? You can't escape elites. They're there from the very beginning of decisions to use military force. And so I contrast this insider's game with the kind of faithful intermediaries model, where elites are just there to transmit voter preferences up the chain and don't really change things along the way. So the implications of this. So first, elite politics, I argue, shape democratic leaders' decisions about war from the initiation phase through escalation and even in some cases termination. And this is normal. It's important to stress here that I'm not suggesting that this is a pathology of democracies, right? This is a normal part of democratic politics that we can't really sweep under the rug, right? We want to treat it as part of the democratic process. How policy gets made in democracies includes this elite bargaining, I argue. And it's not an indictment of the public. That's another important thing to stress. This is not an argument that the public is incapable of holding leaders accountable. It's just starting from the reality that we're all busy people and we need to make sense of a complicated world, and we delegate a lot of this stuff to elites. Elites may sometimes make it easier for leaders to go to war, but they're also an important source of accountability and constraint. And the processes of constraint that we have available to us in democracies often are set in motion by elites. So for democracies, the insider's game can lead to different wars, dysfunctional decisions compared to what you might expect if the voters were holding leaders more directly to account. And probably the strongest claim I make in the book is that in the United States, which is where I focus my analysis primarily for sort of research design reasons, to hold constant domestic institutions and so forth, elite politics introduces a hawkish bias in decisions to use military force. That doesn't mean it always leads to more war, but it definitely puts a thumb on the scale. And I'll try to explain why I think that's a political process rather than some sort of like groupthink or blob story where elites are just warmongering all the time. In fact, one of the implications of the argument is that you can get a hawkish bias even in the presence of many, many very powerful doves. So I'm going to just try to give you a flavor for the theory and then show you some empirical evidence. And I won't be able to go through all of it, but I'll try to just give you a sampling of some of the archival survey evidence that I bring to bear to try to get at the heart of this argument. So theoretically, I sort of start with what I call the constraint toolbox. So thinking just on a basic level about how voters constrain and how elites might be different in terms of how they constrain, right? We want to think about the timing. So elections in the United States happen every 4 years. If you want to put the midterms in there, we have every 2 years. Information. So voters are information takers. They don't generate information necessarily themselves. Preferences is a really tricky question. Like, what do the voters want? What does it mean to say the voters want X? And a lot of ink has been spilled on this question, some of it very prominently by people in this room. But it's hard to make a generalized statement about that. So I start where many others have started, which is that voters basically want to fight the good wars. They want to stay out of the bad wars. They want to win the wars they get into. So they want good performance and moderation. And they also just in general don't have really strong preferences about particular countries on average. There's certainly some who care a lot about different conflicts, but on average, most voters don't have really strong preferences, and these issues are generally low salience to them. The cost that voters can impose is primarily to throw the bums out, right? So this is a pretty blunt tool. It's not the only thing that voters can do, but it's the primary sanction that voters can impose. So let's compare then to elites. And so this picture is Warren Harding emerging from a hotel room in Chicago in the 1920 Republican convention. And apparently this is the origin of the phrase smoke-filled room, because he'd been chosen in this sort of like clandestine way in the smoke-filled room. I don't know if that's actually true, but that's the story that was published in the newspaper the next day. That's supposedly the origin of the term. So think first about timing. You meet elites early and often if you're a decision maker. You can't escape that, right? So the elites have an up close view of the decision making from the very beginning. They're not always not all elites are there all the time, but they have access to the leader in a way that the voter does not, right? They generate information. They're information makers. They can also share information with each other and with the public. They tend to have strong policy preferences, or at least some of them do, right? They're intense policy demanders. They want specific policies, and these things tend to be really important to them. And then they also have a wider range of costs that they can impose on the leader. So they can block the leader's policies, whether those are related to the war or completely unrelated to the war. So Lyndon Johnson believed that his Great Society legislation would not get through if he did not fight the Vietnam War. That may or may not have been correct, but that's clearly what he believed, right? So the stymieing of legislation is one thing they can do. They can sabotage policy. They can just force the leader to expend the scarce time and political capital that it takes to achieve the policy may be the same, but you may have drained more sort of political capital resources, which we know leaders are of it. They can cue other elites, and they can bring in public opinion, right? They can pull the fire alarm and say, okay, public, you need to know there's something not good here and it's time to pay attention, right? So they have a very important role in bringing public opinion in to sort of the larger game. But leaders are not completely passive in this story. In fact, they're not, we shouldn't expect them to be passive. They're politicians after all, right? So they have tools as well, and those tools are not the same when dealing with voters and elites. So if you know your selector theory, you know that the idea is that in a infinitely large sort of coalition, you can't actually dole out private goods or spoils of war because there's too many people, and you can't individually target them with goodies, right? And that's in theory why democratic leaders are pushed to select wars, good wars, to win the wars they fight. So the tools they have for managing that constraint is to either select good wars, win those wars, or persuade voters, which actually it turns out to be very hard to do. Elites have proper names, right? They're finite. You know where they live. You know where they work. You can give them things, and you can give them a lot of different things depending on who they are and what they want. So you can give them side payments or concessions on policy. You can give them appointments or promotions. Famously, the thing people often do is give somebody an ambassadorship. So Kennedy did this with an admiral, a pesky admiral who he sent off to Portugal, right? You can make procedural concessions. You can say, I'll get an authorization from Congress, or I'll get NATO or some other international organization to sign off on it. You can make concessions on war policy. You can say, I'll fight the war, but I'm not going to, but I'll do it. If you support me, I'll fight the war the way you want me to fight it, which is typically something that happens with the military. And you can also just make concessions on completely unrelated or semi-related policies. And so there's a very interesting story in the Truman chapter that I won't have time to get into here about the concessions that Truman made on Taiwan at the start of the Korean War, which really had long-lasting implications for the U.S. commitment to Taiwan. And I'm relieved to see David Chemov nodding vigorously. But really was a political story to try to kind of appease a certain segment of Congress, just to neutralize the Taiwan issue at the start of the Korean War. And then you can also control who knows what, who has access to information, who's cut out of the loop. So you can manage information flow. And so elite bargaining of using these tools changes the decisions compared to a world in which you were just dealing with voter constraints. So let me sort of try to get a little bit deeper into this by first answering a question that I'm sure many of you have already, which is, which elites am I talking about here? So you can easily think of many different kinds of elites that would matter for individual cases, but there's three types of elites that show up in every case of decisions to use military force. And so to keep things tractable, those are the three that I theorize in this book. One is legislatures, so in the US context, members of Congress. Second are military officials. And finally, president's advisors, the top level bureaucrats and appointees. So here we have McNamara, Johnson, and I believe that's not Dean Rusk. Is it Dean Rusk? Yes. You would think I would know that by now. He's sort of a little bit obscured. So I'm going to focus on the role of advisors because the other two have been the subject of massive literatures, and I think we know more about them than we do about the politics of advisors. But just to stress, they all play a very important role in the story in the book. And so I'm going to start with this basic question of why do I treat advisors as political actors, right? These are people chosen by the president. You would think that if you are in the president's inner circle, you serve at the pleasure of the president, right? As we famously all saw in The West Wing. That was one of the number one most uttered lines, I think, on the West Wing. So one reason is because advisors have a range of preferences and they disagree with each other all the time, right? If you've read any case studies of any decision to use military force, you know that it's very rare that there's automatic agreement. So they can disagree with each other, they can disagree with the president. And so a famous case, and I did not just put this in because I'm here at Stanford. This is George Shultz and Caspar Weinberger, who were at each other's throats for most of the time that they both served in the Reagan administration, right? So clearly there can be a lot of disagreement within a presidential administration, even of the same party, right? Second, advisors have motives to speak out, and they know that they can cause political damage if they do that, and presidents know they can do it too, right? So this is Robert McNamara, who changed his mind about the Vietnam War to the point where he wrote a memo that was very damaging to the Johnson administration. And depending on your perspective, Johnson either fired him and moved him to the World Bank, or he resigned and was moved to the World Bank. Historians are still kind of sorting that out, if they ever will. But Johnson was well aware of just how damaging this defection could be, and he managed to keep the elite consensus together for at least a few more months until the Tet Offensive, knowing that McNamara's defection will be really quite damaging. And finally, presidents are aware that advisors can serve as cue givers to the public and to other elites. So I think of this as kind of the Colin Powell effect. So this is Colin Powell making a presentation, his famous presentation to the United Nations. And one reason he was chosen for that job was because he was known to be skeptical of the Iraq War. And so sending him, combined with his gravitas and reputation, was considered a strategically shrewd move inside the Bush administration to try to signal, even Colin Powell thinks that they have WMD. Okay, so how do advisor cues matter? Presidents worry not equally about all advisors, right? Because if your handpicked advisor supports your policy position, that's not really news. So they worry about credible or surprising cues that are informative and newsworthy. And there's a lot of, I'm drawing here very much on the analogous literature in Congress, right? Where if the president's own party supports him, that's not very newsworthy. It's much juicier to hear about the president's own party turning on him, right? So there are really three sources of surprise that you can think about in the advisor context. One is that the advisors just have what I call institutional credibility. They just by virtue of being on the president's team, especially if they oppose what the president is proposing, that's newsworthy, right? Dissent within the White House is a favorite topic of the White House press corps. And there is a lot of evidence that the media oversamples that kind of insidery or insider fighting, right? Intra-party disagreement and so forth. The second is that we have party brands, and advisors can reinforce or counter these party brands or stereotypes. And the ones that presidents worry about in this context, the Democratic presidents worry about this long-standing problem of Democrats appearing weak on national security. despite fighting many wars, which is a puzzle in its own right. And Republicans worry about, oh, did I do that? I don't think I.
Can't say bad things about the Democrats.
Well, it cut me off right before I was about to say bad things about the Republicans. So. All right. So the Republicans worry more about being seen as overly bellicose, right? And there's obviously a question I often get is like, how can you say that Democrats are doves when they've fought, they dropped the atomic bomb? They're the only ones who dropped the atomic bomb. Again, I'm not so much saying that all Democrats are weak or dovish and all Republicans are overly bellicose, but these are stereotypes that all leaders from these parties are tarred with one way or the other, right? So this is sort of a broad, that's why they're stereotypes, right? They're catching people who don't necessarily belong in that category, and they have political consequences. And third is, again, going back to Colin Powell, statements that are against the advisor's own type are more credible, right? So hawkish advisors, if John Bolton doesn't want to fight a war, that gets attention, right? I mean, if Bolton doesn't want to fight, then it's probably a bad idea. And likewise, it's hard to sort of think of like doves inside a Republican administration, but there's often more restrained advisors who are very cautious about using force. I'd put Powell in that category. If they support war, as Bush well knew, that is likely to be more credible. So that means when you put all this together, I argue that we have a hawkish bias. And again, it's more of a thumb on the scale. It's not determinative. But there are three sources of hawkish bias that I think are really important. And again, I've put on here Democratic president and Republican president primarily because it fits better. But what I really mean here is leaders from dovish parties and leaders from hawkish parties, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that all Democratic presidents are dovish, but that's the stereotype that they're kind of like struggling with or living in fear of. So one is selection pressure. So it's interesting that there have been a lot of Republican secretaries of defense in Democratic administrations, but it's never gone the other way, right? So often Democratic presidents try to close their credibility gap by appointing hawks. The problem with that is once you bring them inside, then they have that front row seat and can put pressure on you to take more hawkish decisions, right? So there's higher selection pressure to kind of go against type on Democratic presidents than on Republican presidents, who in general enjoy more credibility, for better or for worse, on national security. The second is what I call agenda costs. So presidents don't get to pick their crises. They often don't really want, we're living through a presidency that has had two major crises that he didn't bargain for, right? Ukraine and Gaza. They want to do, even if they are sort of national security types that are comfortable talking and focusing on national security, they want to do other things too. Americanists have shown that the legislative agenda is more complicated and larger in general for Democratic presidents. So the costs of getting sidetracked by national security are a lot higher for dovish parties that typically prioritize non-security issues. Whereas national security is pretty central to hawkish parties' identity often and their agenda. And so it's not that they have no agenda costs, they just on average tend to be lower. And then finally, with probably the clunkiest title, but it's important, I think, to understand the nature of what I'm talking about, is the cost of getting a counter-type elite to support you. So again, going back to John Bolton, if you are a president who has John Bolton as an advisor, and you do not want to fight, and you would like to have John Bolton endorse your decision not to fight, think about what you have to give him to get his endorsement for staying out if he doesn't really believe that's the right course, right? A nuclear weapon of his own or something. It's very hard to get hawkish elites to endorse a dovish policy, right? It's difficult to co-opt the hawks for dovish policies, partly because hawkish elites don't get a lot of private benefit from that, right? There's not a lot that hawks get out of supporting the policy of a dovish leader, right? If it's their own leader, that's different. But if it's somebody who is dovish that they have to endorse, and I'm thinking here also of members of Congress, right? That's a very, very hard get to co-opt a dove from the other party. In contrast, dovish elites often actually, even if they think the war is a bad idea, they get something from supporting the use of military force. It could be something like a private benefit, and this I think is one reason why many of the Democrats who wanted to run for president in 2004 endorsed the Iraq War despite their misgivings, right? That they thought that was going to be the winning side of the argument, and so they wanted to be on record as having supported it. It could also be that they don't support the war, but they think that the right thing for their party to do is to fight a limited war to neutralize that issue, and they sort of get to then spend their time doing the other things that they really do want to do. So it is much easier for Republicans to co-opt doves for war than it is for Democrats to co-opt hawks for peace. And that means that hawks in general have an easier time being themselves than doves. And so ultimately, what does this lead to, right? And one question in the beginning of this project, going back to kind of like the evolution of the theory and everything, in the beginning, it was like, okay, well, so war is made by insiders. And someone said to me, okay, but does that mean more war, less war, different war? Like what? What does it all add up to? And so the upshot of this is two sort of ideal typical changes from what we would expect in a sort of symmetrical, everybody has incentives to act against type voter constraint kind of model. One is what I call the dove's curse. So these examples include the Korean War and the Vietnam War. And I think of these as sort of extra wars that you would not expect from the Democratic Party, compared to a world, again, where the voters are constraining more directly. And again, the reason is because they tend to appoint and accommodate hawks, which leads to more hawkish policies. There's a very high price to be paid to stay out of war or to de-escalate, and it hands the opposition a cudgel that they can use. This is what Lyndon Johnson was afraid of. It wasn't that he thought the Vietnam War was such a good idea. He was worried that if he asked these elites to accept that he wasn't going to fight in Vietnam, he could not then turn to them and say, okay, now you Democratic hawks, Southern Democratic hawks, please support my civil rights bill, right? They would turn around and use the weakness charge against him. So the cost may be high enough that a little war or a war you believe will stay small might be more appealing. It might actually be easier to fight. And so you end up getting into more wars that are fought with sort of a minimum necessary troop level. This is the famous Gelb and Betts argument about the Vietnam War, that you think you can manage, and then you end up on this ratchet effect where you've got these hawks who are saying, but you're not doing enough. And then you have to placate them, but you never actually go all in to try to really win the war. So you end up with longer and inconclusive wars that I call dove's curse. So in contrast, because this is a pox on both your houses kind of story, right? That where both the Democrats and the Republicans have their sort of pathological outcome, but they are of very different types, right? So for the Republicans, they have what I call the risk of a hawk's misadventure, right? So this is Reagan in Lebanon, and I would argue the Iraq War. So Republicans just have more freedom of movement, right? They can choose war, they can choose peace. They have much more flexibility to be themselves, which in this case means wanting to fight. It's much easier for them to evade the constraints ex ante, right? They can get into the war they can more easily get around elite constraints. But once they get into war, that's their brand. So they better win, right? They're much more at risk politically if the war turns sour. And that's where elites start to really pay attention and can constrain leaders, even if the public hasn't turned against the war, which is what happened with Reagan in Lebanon. His own party even began to turn against him. And so what Republicans seek is resolution, or something that they can call a resolution. They're sort of gambling for a decision, something they can, just say, okay, it's over now. And so I would argue that leads to kind of, in a sort of U-shaped fashion, shorter or longer war. So either you decide, as Reagan did, okay, this isn't worth it, and you withdraw troops despite not having changed your mind about whether it's a good idea, or you gamble for something like the Iraq surge, where Bush was looking for something that he could call a victory, right? And I think some of Richard Nixon's actions in Vietnam also fit that description. So I won't have time to go into all the empirical evidence, but I want to just try to give you a flavor for how I approached trying to test this theory, which is difficult to test in a lot of ways, because if in the real world presidents are trying to avoid paying these costs, you won't observe them very often, right? And so how do we try to find evidence of this kind of strategic behavior if the fire alarm doesn't get pulled very often, right? We know that advisors rarely resign in protest, but of course that's partly because presidents work very, very, very hard to make sure that that's a very rare event. So I have an approach that combines survey experiments and case studies, and I think it's a pretty interesting combination. So the survey experiments are not designed to show what necessarily like the best message or messenger is in terms of public opinion. They're designed to show that if these advisor cues ever reach the public, the particular cues that I theorize will be the ones that are the most credible or not. And so then I can identify kind of like what is the price of an advisor's support. So we'd expect that it would take a lot more to co-opt a John Bolton than to co-opt some of the Democrats in Congress for the Iraq War. And then I use case studies to show that, in fact, the presidents are worried about those particular elites. In my first book, as I said, I went to pretty much everywhere but Truman. So this time I went to the Truman Library, also the Johnson Library, the Reagan Library, and then the papers of Tip O'Neill and James Baker and John Foster Dulles, who plays a fascinating role in the origins of the Taiwan commitment. And so I'm not even looking at his time as Secretary of State. I'm looking at his time as an advisor inside the Truman State Department. Again, brought in to provide some Republican cover to help Truman deal with this charge of being weak on national security. So I'm not going to go through all this. There's a lot of public opinion data in one of the chapters, and I couldn't possibly even remember what most of it says at this point. But I did just want to give you one sort of piece of empirical evidence from the survey experiments. And this is a very large scale, large experiment that I did in March of 2016. And it's a pretty familiar, if any of you are familiar with this type of work, it was deliberately based on a commonly used kind of cross-border invasion scenario where one country invades its neighbor and the US has to decide whether it's going to intervene. And I can go into the details of it if you want, but I think for purposes of this, I'll keep it at a pretty generic high level. So the things I'm varying include the president's party. So the president could be a Democrat or a Republican. There can be 5 different conditions of advisors. So there's a baseline condition where in every condition, it says the president debates with his advisors. But in the baseline condition, that's all. And then in the other 4 conditions, you can have 2 advisor types. The advisor can be hawkish or dovish. And I tell people what that means. So I say hawkish advisor who usually recommends using force when others don't, et cetera. And then they can support or oppose the use of force. I'm telling you what the advisors said before. And then I stop and ask, okay, do you support the war? Do you support invasion or not? Or pushing back the invaders? And then I tell the respondents what the decision was, right? So did they decide to send troops, and was it over the objection of advisors or with the support of the hawkish or dovish advisor? And then I ask for whether you approve of the president's handling of the use of force. So I just want to show you one result from this, and I break it down a lot of different ways, but this I think is the most kind of summary finding. So here we have Democratic presidents. And so on the top, we have the 2 conditions. I've omitted the baseline because it's essentially very similar to, it's always similar to supporting the president's decision. So on the top, we have whether the hawkish advisor supports or opposes the use of force. And on the bottom, we have the dovish advisor. And what you see here is that for the Democratic president, if you want to not use force, so this is essentially the difference between in approval for deciding to send troops versus staying out, right? So I think of this as the fighting premium, like how much approval benefit do you get from choosing to fight? And so here's the 0 line. So I don't want to trip, so I'll, whoops. Where's my, oh, all right, never mind. You see the 0 line over here. So everything on that side means fighting is favored. And if it's to the left, if it's negative, then staying out is favored. So if you are a Democratic president and you don't want to fight, what you really need is to get a John Bolton to help you by endorsing staying out, right? And that difference in differences is 31 percentage points. It's a huge difference. It makes the difference between the public approving like 60-40 versus flipping it entirely. And what the dovish advisor says makes almost no difference. In contrast, if you look at the Republican side, the interesting thing is the hawks actually have a lot of credibility the hawks actually have some credibility. It's much weaker than it is for the Democrats, but the hawks have some credibility, which makes the difference here not as stark. But the biggest effect is from the dovish advisor. So that's Colin Powell, right? If you want to fight as a Republican, you want a Colin Powell, the more restrained advisor, to endorse using military force. And so this is just a flavor of some of the kind of empirical results that I go into, and I have several other experiments that get at various aspects of the theory. And then the rest of the book is archival case studies. And so I just want to show you 1 or 2 documents that I think are pretty interesting illustrations of some of this, and then I'll wrap up and look forward to your comments. So this is a document from the LBJ library, and it's it's a memo by Jack Valenti, who before he was, I remember him from watching the Oscars as a kid, and he was like the head of the Motion Picture Academy. But he really, you know, his background was as a political advisor to LBJ. So he was very much on the political side of things. So he's writing a memo dated November 14th, 1964. So this is after the defeat by Johnson of Barry Goldwater, right? So Johnson's won a term in his own right, and he's just defeated an uber hawk. And here we now know that a lot of the decisions about escalating the war in Vietnam had already been made by this point in secret. This is Jack Valenti saying, before you make the final decisions on Vietnam, you should have the chiefs sign on, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And if something should go wrong later, an investigation should begin in Congress. It would be beneficial to have the chiefs definitely a part of the presidential decision, so there can be no recriminations at these hearings should they be held. So this is, but again, before the war is being escalated, right after the election, one of Johnson's chief political advisors is already worrying about the inevitable hearings that will take place. I mean, that's pretty unbelievable, right? And it's partly because he knows it's so controversial and it might not work. And so that way they will have been part of the consensus, and our flank will have been covered in the event of some kind of flap or investigation later. And, you know, sure enough. This is, for all the grad students in the room, I always say, if you want to curse in print, you should study LBJ. And also LBJ taped everything until, you know, they all did until Nixon kind of ruined it, but at least that we know of. But LBJ also said the quiet part out loud. He would talk about domestic politics in a way that other presidents just naturally, it's sort of distasteful to talk about national security and politics. So here is LBJ talking with McNamara, and this is one of many, many conversations. In fact, he has a similar conversation with the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, on the same day. And he's talking about Henry Cabot Lodge, who had been appointed by Kennedy to be ambassador in Saigon. And Henry Cabot Lodge was a Republican, and the concern was they needed Republican cover in case the Vietnam situation went poorly. And so they brought in Lodge, and then Johnson kept him in part because he was so worried that Lodge was going to go back and run against him for the presidency. So he says in this conversation, I sure as hell don't want to get in the position of Lodge recommended something and we turned him down. And then he says, well, why don't we clear it up so we get him answered? I think politically, I'm not a military strategist. That is certainly true. But I think as long as we've got him there and he makes recommendations and we act on them, we're not in too bad a condition politically. But if he asks for something and we don't give it to him, we are caught with our britches down. And then he says, let's make a record on this thing, Bob. I'd like to wire out there to him nearly every day on something, either approving what he's recommending or trying to goose him up to do a little something extra, right? And Lodge's position was more hawkish than Johnson's, and he's saying, like, let's try to give him what he wants, or just give him a little bit more to keep him happy, right? And that is pushing policy in a more hawkish direction. And then I want to also talk a little bit about the Iraq case and the sort of Hawks misadventure of the Iraq War. And you may remember that Congress, of course, authorized the Iraq War in 2002, a law that is still on the books, as is, by the way, the 1957 authorization to use force in the Middle East under President Eisenhower. And here we have the Rose Garden ceremony where Bush announced the compromise resolution. And what's interesting about this photo is you see Dennis Hastert, and then Bush, and then Trent Lott from the Senate leader. I can never remember at this point who was, I think he was the minority leader. And then you have Dick Gephardt. Who's missing from this picture is Tom Daschle, who was the Senate Democratic leader. And Gephardt was there in his place because Gephardt wanted to run for president and was known to have, not thought the war was such a great idea. But he wanted to be the one to cut the deal with Bush because, again, that was supposed to be the winning side to be on, right? You want to be on the side of the war you think is going to go well. And so the LA Times, the headline, liberal Gephardt sides with Bush on the Iraq War resolution. And the lead here says, by winning the blessing of the liberal House Democratic leader, President Bush scored a coup Wednesday in his drive for a strong show of bipartisan support for a war resolution to confront Saddam Hussein. And there's the signing ceremony. We have Joe Biden all the way on the end there. And again, it was considered a political prize to be the Democrat who cut the deal. And Daschle, he went around Daschle, who was very, very, very angry with him. But Gephardt got his Rose Garden picture, which again was at the time considered a big prize. And so this procedural concession that Bush made, which really didn't actually change much, and similarly, Colin Powell got him to go to the UN, was relatively easy for Bush to obtain that dovish endorsement compared to what the Democrats have to do to get a hawk to endorse peace. And so that's one reason why it's much easier for Republicans to be themselves, and they can evade constraint up front. Okay, so what does this mean for IR theory? The burning question, I'm sure, on everyone's mind. One conclusion is that the domestic politics of war are often elite politics, at least in the first instance. Doesn't mean it cannot become a public issue, but it often stays inside elite circles with real consequences for war and peace. And then elites are often the effective audience for decisions about the use of force. And there's been a spate of findings, Jessica Weiss, and others, that democracies and some constrained authoritarian regimes can achieve sort of similar rates of winning wars and similar rates of initiating wars. So this is a sort of explanation from the Democratic side that helps us make sense of why those behaviors might be relatively similar. And so I think one implication is a lot of our comparisons across regime type in terms of, do democracies behave differently? Do they have advantages in war and coercive diplomacy and so forth? They're comparing autocratic elites with voters. And so an implication is not that voters are irrelevant, but that we also need to study the differences in elite politics, where we're comparing elites in autocracies and elites in democracies. So I will stop there and look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you. Okay, comments, questions, concerns. I have many which I can always launch in on if I see kind of a hand down there. Yeah. Go ahead, Jim. I don't see any other hands right now.
You want to start with a hello?
Yeah, I don't see any others though. Am I missing a fellow? Sorry, I'm very short. You might have to. Oh, both Jims. So no fellows yet. Just the Jim.
Thanks. Really good. And I totally agree with the overall thesis. I guess two small.
That's enough. You can, next question.
Two small things. Like, so, yes, elite politics, but it seemed like your argument about the elite politics, in some sense, it's intermediating between the public and the leaders. So you gave us examples where the leader is choosing someone because they will be more credible signaling to, or they're dealing with them because they're concerned about ultimately the voters, right?
Yeah, so there is a selection. I mean, thinking about Mike's work with Jessica Weeks and Karen Yarhimilo, there is the selection issue, but I think the larger question is, are presidents always choosing advisors based on the expectations of what the public will think of them? Sometimes yes, but often not, right? They might be there to appease a certain wing of the party. They might be there because they provide a certain kind of expertise. And so you end up with national security advisors and foreign policy advisors who kind of run the gamut and might not necessarily agree on all these issues. And then, of course, you can't predict as president what crises are going to come down the pike. So Bush puts together a cabinet on the principle that he will undo all the Clintonian nation building stuff. And 9 months later, you get 9/11, right? So I think there's a limit to how much selection can be connected directly to public opinion. But it's certainly, it's not an irrelevant concern for some appointments.
Then the other small thing was I'm wondering if in your work, do you see a dynamic? I've often wondered if there's a hawkish bias that comes from like if you're not actually the person responsible, like the president or for the decision, is there not sometimes an incentive to say like, yeah, you got to be tougher, because if it doesn't go well, you can say, well, you weren't tough enough. Maybe this applies more to the out party or people in Congress and so on. Whereas if you say like, no, you should be more dovish and it goes badly, it seems like it's harder to argue that like, well, you should have been even more dovish because that'd be like giving away the store, as it were.
So you're arguing that the bias is just from the nature of the action as opposed to the party reputation?
Well, to be honest, I was just last week in an environment of, let's say, former Bush administration foreign policy professionals.
So Jim, you're being signaled to use the microphone, so we have an online.
Former Bush administration foreign policy professionals, and man, like Biden was not being tough enough about anything. I mean, this is kind of a Republican that doesn't really exist in the real world anymore, but it's still interesting to see. And it seemed like and it reminded me, I mean, it's not like they didn't have substantive arguments, but there's like a kind of a thing of like, if it's in some sense easier to, it seems like in American politics in general, to like say like, oh yeah, you got to be tougher.
Yeah, better to be too hawkish.
And if you're not responsible for, nuclear escalation in Ukraine or something, then it's easier to say like, oh yeah, they should have been tougher, right?
So I think that's right. But I don't think it negates the fact that concern is politically more damaging to Democrats, right? That's what it's just they have a credibility problem. They can't credibly signal whether they're being insufficiently. I mean, I think Biden and Ukraine is a really good example, right? Where part of why he's not being tougher is because he's actually quite aware and worrying about the escalation risks. He's hardly a dove, right? So, but he's acutely aware of it, but he also cannot escape the sort of Democrats are wimpy doves stereotype. And so Republicans can say that with much greater consequence because he can't credibly separate he can't say, well, I know I'm a Democrat, but this is really the right policy, right? And so I think that credibility gap is something that really just weighs on Democrats and makes that, I think that it is, there is this sort of like better to be more hawkish than dovish, but it's why you often get hawkish policies from a room full of doves, right? Because it's a more politically potent argument against a Democrat. Thanks.
I should remind you to please introduce yourself when you ask your question, and I've got a list going. Go ahead.
Yeah, Jim Goldgeier, visiting scholar at CSAC, former colleague of Elizabeth's at George Washington. Great talk, great book.
Jim wins the award for having read the most number of drafts. So.
Well, enjoyed him for enjoyed it every time. So I wanted the talk focused on this, the issue of initiation of the use of force, Johnson 64, Bush 8 in 2003. Just wondering about sort of expanding the argument to something like the situation today that Biden faces within the Democratic Party on Israel-Gaza, where you have a number of senators who, you know, are not on the far left, who are starting to say, look, we support it. We support this, you know, the idea of a state of Israel. We do not support what Israel's doing in Gaza, and talking about conditioning the aid and all of that. Like, what could that elite activity change what the president does with respect to the war, or like what difference do you expect it could make?
I mean, I think one thing is that we have to kind of avoid the, I think it's Brendan Nyhan who calls it the Green Lantern theory of the presidency, that like the president can fix everything. And I think that's one problem, like, you know, that students don't understand sometimes, is that, you know, the president can't just go like that and fix and end the war. But I think what's interesting about the Israel-Gaza case is that support for Israel traditionally has been a cross-cutting, like it hasn't always gone on partisan lines, which is, there are not that many things left like that, right? And the support that the Democrats have given Israel, I mean, it is true that it's become more polarized in recent years, but I think the war has actually made it more kind of cross-cutting, because as you say, Democrats have become, you know, have changed somewhat on their position. And it's really important for there to be differences in the parties and within the parties for the theory to make sense, right? So if the other party is just going to oppose whatever you say as president, then they can't actually like be informative to anybody, because this is, I'm drawing on Ken Schultz's work here, right? There has to be some chance that they will actually support you. They have to be gettable. And I think the possibilities of actually getting bipartisan support, or at least some crossover, is probably an important dynamic here. But whether it can actually lead to the end of the war is really probably more up to the Israelis than to Biden.
But like changing policy with respect to this whole issue of conditioning.
Oh yes, I mean yes, it's possible we might make a change in our policy, whether it induces the Israelis. I mean, that's a separate question, but it does seem as though there is more willingness to kind of, I mean, Schumer's speech, I think, was pretty important, right? Where he says it's time for Netanyahu to go. Like that's surprising, credible, different, unexpected.
We're going to make our way to Mike Toms. I want to just follow up with the political appointment question.
Mm-hmm.
So I wrote a very unpopular op-ed when Secretary Austin was picked, saying basically President Biden picked him because he'll just do whatever President Biden says, but he doesn't know anything about the issues at hand, right? China, great power, air, sea. So if you take your argument to the conclusion, there is a balance between wanting expertise and wanting support. So should we expect that Republican presidents have sort of advisors and elites with more expertise because they don't have to worry about that support, and Democratic leaders are going to pick more yes men?
That's a great question. So my instinct would be to say no, because the case that I have written about in this context is George W. Bush, who picked really experienced advisors precisely because he knew he didn't have any foreign policy experience. So, I mean, he went on Meet the Press and said, don't worry, I'll have, Condi Rice as my tutor, right? And that turned out to be problematic for a lot of reasons, but so I don't necessarily think, I mean, I think yes, they may not feel they don't feel the selection pressure as much. I do think the Austin case is really interesting because if you think back to the withdrawal from Afghanistan, because it's not so much that he'd do anything, it was that he would specifically follow Biden's desire to withdraw from Afghanistan, which Biden was quite worried about. And if you think back to the summer when Kabul fell, as terrible as all the news was, there was really not much there were not anonymous critiques of Biden's decision from inside his own team. And I think that's because he chose people he knew would follow through on Afghanistan, right? So, and I didn't, every book needs a 2x2, right? So I didn't get into this, I spared you, but I'll show you now, right? So here's the 2x2 in the book. And so here what I have is the leader from the Dovish party, leader from the Hawkish party, and they can choose peace or they can choose war. And obviously for the Dovish party, the stereotypical be yourself move is peace. So that's sort of acting for type. Against type would be fighting, right? And opposite for the Hawks. So it's not only the Dove's curse and the Hawks misadventure. So the full spectrum includes the Dove deciding to stay out and just absorbing the costs, right? And so this is what I call the Dove's choice. And I think this is what Biden did in Afghanistan. Now, he was helped by a lot of things. He was helped by Trump having tried to get out of Afghanistan and cutting the deal, right? The public had already soured on it. Nonetheless, if you think back to that summer, people turned on the decision pretty quickly when the military side of it really, when Kabul fell and things began to unravel. And it would have been, it's easy to imagine another world in which the Democratic president withdrawing decides to leave 2,500 troops or keep Bagram Air Base under pressure to sort of like stabilize the situation. And Biden came out, not only did he not do that, but he came out and made a very strong speech that said, I'm sticking to my guns. I'm not going to be the 5th or 6th president in a row to hand this crisis off. And to me, that signals like he might not have expected it would be as bad as it was, but he was willing to absorb political costs and he set up his team in order to do that, right? So then this is the Dove's curse, right? Where acting against type is actually sometimes the cheaper, or they think it'll be the cheaper option, turns out not to be in the end. This is the Hawks making peace is the so-called Hawks advantage, right? But I think that's only one part of the story, right? So this is the Nixon to China, right? Nixon can go to China more easily than a Dove can, but it's this difference between the peace and war, whether that's true or against type, that's really important. And so there you have the Hawks misadventure. And so if we were thinking about this symmetrically in a sort of faithful intermediaries model where everybody has an incentive to kind of cross over and go against type sometimes, we would expect that the Hawks advantage and the Dove's curse would be the acting against type would be sort of symmetrical. But what we see is, or what I'm arguing is, in fact, the politics are asymmetric, right? And so the Hawks can act true to type, and the Doves have, their incentives are to more, that they have more incentive to act against type. And so both of those outcomes are war outcomes. And that is where the asymmetry comes from. And notably, it's coming from the Democratic side, right? It's sort of a surplus of Democratic wars.
Go ahead, Mike.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Elizabeth. This is really terrific. I had two questions that I wanted to ask.
I messed it up too, but can you introduce yourself to the online audience?
Mike Toms from the Political Science Department here. And I had two questions that I wanted to ask you, and they're both about what you said is your most provocative claim. In the United States, elite politics induces a hawkish bias.
Mm-hmm.
So the first question sort of connects with something that Jim was asking before. I'm wanting to know whether elites are really necessary for this. Like in theory, couldn't you get the same prediction of a hawkish bias in a model that just had the president and the public without the elites? Or do you think that the elites are somehow necessary in order to generate the hawkish bias? So that's question number one. Question two is about the preface to your, the clause that begins your most provocative claim, which is in the United States, elite politics induces a hawkish bias. Are you thinking that your theory does or doesn't predict a hawkish bias in other democracies? Like what would you say about Western Europe or Latin America, for example? Would you think that there would also be a hawkish bias there? Or if not, why not?
Both great questions that I spent a lot of time thinking about, right? Could you get the hawkish bias from the public? I think there are worlds in which you can, right? You could say maybe that, leaders are always wanting to err on the side of being too hawkish rather than because they don't want to make the mistake of not doing something that could have been prevented. But it isn't so much that I think elites are necessary as that they are there and doing this. And so we can't leave them out. Like we're missing a hugely important part of the story if we don't take them into account. And they may in turn be feeding the natural tendency to do something, right? The question of whether it travels or not, I wrestled with for a long time. Like there was a real framing question about whether this was a book about the US or a book about democracies in general. And I definitely held on to it's a book about democracies in general. Like I do feel like this is a common, there is a story here that is important for comparing democracies generally to autocracies. But I do think that the institutional variation is really important. Like we have a separation of power system, and that has real consequences for how elite politics plays out. So if you think about like the German coalition, the traffic light, right, Anna? Is that, I don't want to, yeah. Where, when the war in Ukraine, when Russia invaded Ukraine, Olaf Scholz was like quite reluctant to actually be as hawkish as a lot of people wanted him to be. And oddly, it was like the Green Party that was pushing him to be more hawkish. But the problem is in a coalition parliamentary setup, you don't know whether Annalena Baerbock is pushing him because she thinks that's the right policy or because she wants it to be good for her politically down the line. Like she's inside the government. And I feel like a game theorist who works on legislatures has to solve that one. So I think it may be, but it may be complicated by the institutional arrangements.
It may be interesting then to make the comparison with presidential, which is why I mentioned.
Yeah. I mean, one issue is that the United States is the country that has the luxury or burden or insert your favorite adjective, right? Like it's the country that makes these decisions most often. So.
Anna Grzmobs, political science. Thank you for a fantastic talk. And I just had some questions about, public opinion influencing the elites.
Mm-hmm.
So what if the war is very unpopular with the public, right? Will hawks, for example, be more likely to push for peace, but not be as credible because they're just seen as reflecting public? Or can doves sort of, persuade a president by saying, look, this is incredibly politically costly, and so you shouldn't do this? I'm sort of wondering what, how public opinion about the war can influence these elite interactions.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a chicken and egg problem that will never really be answered ever about whether, and people that take very strong opinions in this debate, right? Top down, public, Walter Lippmann and Hans Morgenthau basically thought the public would just follow whatever the elites did, which is clearly too strong. And then there's the bottom up, like everybody pays attention all the time and kind of scorecard voting, which is also clearly not right. And to me, the most interesting is somewhere in between, where clearly the politicians pay attention to what their constituents say or what they believe they would say, kind of latent public opinion. But to me, what's interesting is how long presidents can hold the public at bay, right? We think of the 1968 election as the Vietnam protest election. But through many, many different kinds of machinations, Lyndon Johnson kept the war going up until the Tet Offensive. And then Richard Nixon promised a secret plan to end the war, got elected, and then kept going, the war didn't end for another, 7 years. And the same with Iraq. Those big, huge public protests that we remember in European capitals did not stop the war. And so it's not that the protest doesn't matter and that it doesn't eventually have an effect. It's just that it's a very slow process. And in that space, elites can do an awful lot to try to shape the environment or to disrupt the coordination of voters, right? They can paint their opponents as unpatriotic. That's Bush did a lot of that, right? They can say, once you get into a war, it's really hard to be anti-war because it seems like you're undercutting the troops. Like, I voted for the $87 billion before I voted against it, John Kerry, right? Because then you're taking the money away from the troops. So disrupting the coordination of voters, it's really hard to get them to focus on. In 2006, it took the Democrats until almost like March of that year to decide they were even going to make Iraq like a midterm election issue. They did not think it would be a winning issue. And that was the nadir of Iraq, right? So it takes a long time because of all these different ways that leaders can interrupt that process.
Just want to remind the people online that I'm continuing to monitor your chat and I'm here asking the questions that you have. So if you have any further questions, please put them in the chat and I'll turn over to Scott.
I'm Scott Sagan, co-director here at CSAC and professor of political science. Can you talk about how civil-military relations and military officers or recently retired military officers fit into this?
Who become secretaries of defense?
Who become secretaries of defense or national security advisors? Oriana gave the example of Austin, but most of the cases I can think of are Republicans with Powell or Haig in Reagan administration, or Mattis, or recently retired Esper, Pompeo, McMaster. It's actually active, right? And in the Cold War, I've always thought that those guys were hawks. But in post-Cold War period, many of them, if not all of them, are doves by. So how do you think about civil-military relations and how this fits into your thinking?
This is another question that there's this debate about whether the military leaders are more inclined to recommend force or more conservative about it. Yeah.
To escalate if you're.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's the one that people kind of agree on is once you're in the war, they don't want to take half measures. But there's a disagreement about the initiation advice. And I sort of decided in the end, I didn't need to actually take a position on that debate because what really mattered to me was whatever the cost of getting, because sometimes it's the president wanting them to be on board with a lower level of escalation. And sometimes it's wanting them to go along with or initiation. And sometimes it's the president wanting to start a war that they don't necessarily want to do. And so it's about the price of getting them on board with the president's policy more than it is, and what the politics of the relationship between the president and the military is. So that to me is more important than whether on average the military is pro or anti-war in any particular instance. But you're right that there is a lot of variation empirically.
And I'm going to keep looking for questions. I have one more that I can ask while I'm looking around.
There's one back there.
Yeah, Rose. Then I'm going to ask you a really unpopular Taiwan War one. I'll wait for it.
I think you asked that at Georgetown too.
What about the war in Taiwan?
Hi, I'm Rose Gadamuller. I'm a lecturer here at CSAC, and it's wonderful, thoughtful presentation today. But I was wanting to ask you about cases where presidents escape their elites. And I'm thinking of the case that George Shultz always used to love to talk about, which was President Reagan basically shutting out his very hawkish cabinet as he was deciding to go, make a flip from the evil empire to, reaching out to Gorbachev. So how does your theory account for that?
I got a document. Let's see. I gotta find it first. See if I can. No, not quite, but okay. Alrighty, so this is not quite right. Let's see. Nope, that's not it either. Nope, there it is. I got it. Whoops. Okay, so this is a great question. And I think it gets back to this issue of the Hawks' advantage in making peace. And one thing that sometimes I think gets forgotten in the Nixon to China kind of story, and here you have the same kind of dynamic of like Reagan goes to Reykjavik. Before they did that, they were really hawkish. Like they had to establish, like the reason why Nixon was able to go to China was because he'd been unbelievably tough as vice president under Eisenhower and taken these very, very hawkish positions. You know, think of all the things he did in Vietnam, Cambodia, and so forth. And the same with Reagan, right? That he was building this image that then allowed him to be peacemaker. And so one thing that happened in Lebanon was his own political advisors and also members of his own party, like Howard Baker, who opposed this from the beginning, began to say, like, you are gambling your ability to do other things in the national security space by having this small little war that's going wrong, right? So it's really hard to read, but this is Jim Baker, right, who always was thinking about the politics. And he was chief of staff at this point. And this is his senior staff meeting notes from December of 1983. So this is after the bombing in the Marine barracks, but before the withdrawal. And he says here, Time Inc. poll, most important problem is war, ability to keep the country out of war, the one thing Reagan gets a negative rating on. And I think one of the other documents I have here, he's saying here that Reagan would have to make phone calls to hold 18 months, meaning like to get a war powers resolution extension to let the Marines stay for 18 months. And it all had to do with like, was there live firing and hostilities? That was the big war powers debate. Like, were we in hostilities in Beirut? And the risk was that he was being seen as overly hawkish and then squandering his credibility on national security. And so I think that the idea of like wasting your national security capital on Lebanon or damaging your reputation for national security competence on Lebanon really weighed on the political advisors. And so here's another one. This is a meeting with the legislative affairs team, Richard Darman and others. And so these are Baker's handwritten comments. And he says, if we don't report, we'll lose congressional support. And if so, like, what specific cost is likely to be associated with that loss? I mean, it's a truism of archival work that they never have the documents that say, like, the documents aren't written with your theory in mind. This one was, right? What's the cost of losing the support? Negative language on appropriations, would we wish to veto? And so basically he writes here, are we going to shut down the government in order to allow ourselves to continue to wage war in Lebanon, right? So I think the concern among the national security team was, what we need to preserve here is our reputation for competence on national security. We had better end this if it's not going to go well, because we have other things we want to do in this space. And so Baker certainly knew that's what Reagan wanted to do, was to make a deal, make peace. And so I think that's what links all of this together, right? The making peace, the Hawks' advantage in making peace depends a lot on what the Hawks do in war as well.
So the back and forth on doves and hawks, I don't know if you want to go back to the 4x4, but my question is this. China attacks Taiwan, the United States 100% defends Taiwan. What does that war look like in the Dove's Curse? We don't know who the future
Goodness.
president is. What does it look like in the Hawk's Misadventure? And where is the part of the we just do an awesome job and win the war and everything is great? Like, where is that in the 4x4? Or does it always kind of end badly?
No. Okay. So what do I want to show you here? You wanted to see the 2x2.
Right. Which is worse in that scenario, the
Um,
Dove's Curse or a Hawk's Misadventure? Who should we vote for?
So let me make sure. Well, first of all, I wanted to show you a, oh, I was one off. All right. Okay, so here I'll show you some public opinion data that I gathered. I have a lot of public opinion data in the book, and among the things I did over many years from 2008 to 2022 is asking basic factual questions to kind of try to get at what does the public know. And so this is sort of interesting because it's a range of questions, and the public, again, the public can learn about foreign policy issues when it's in the media. So this is 2016, they knew that the voters in Great Britain had decided to leave the European Union, right? 74% got that one right. Main point of conflict between the US and Iran in 2008, they knew it was the nuclear program, which is the largest trading partner. Only 11% got Canada right. Most people said China. 2016, right? The election that's supposedly all about like Trump and Clinton and trade and all, loss of manufacturing jobs. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is a trade agreement between the U.S. and countries in Asia and the Pacific Rim. Is China a part of the TPP agreement? Only 28% correctly said no. And then the reason I was thinking of this one, right? This slide. This is one that I asked in 2022. This is in the Cooperative Congressional Election Study. So these are studies that are done in presidential and midterm election years. To the best of your knowledge, does the United States have a defense agreement with Taiwan that obligates the US to intervene militarily to help Taiwan if the Chinese government were to attack or invade the island? 21% correctly knew that the answer is no, we don't, right? We did it one time, as you well know, but we don't now. We have an obligation to provide them with arms to defend themselves. So to me, that's not oh my God, the public is so dumb, right? It's very complicated. And it's also like, but it is an important place to start, right? Like this is the baseline that we'd be starting from if that happened. In terms of, so your question about would it be worse? Your question was, would it be worse if
you had a Taiwan case study under Dove's Curse? Taiwan 2027, is that if that's a Dove's Curse case or if that's a Hawk's Misadventure case, which is worse for us?
Worse for us? I mean,
as Americans.
Yeah, I mean, that's a hard question to answer in terms, because we don't really know what China, well, you probably know, but like what is China's amphibious assault capability and so forth. I was talking with one of the students today about that. I think it depends on if it's a Republican president in office or a Democratic president in office, and also whether we're still as extremely polarization. No one asked me about this, but it has profound implications for this. And I think it's still important to understand this dynamic, to know where constraints are, and to, if you want to improve decision-making, not including this is really problematic. But it's the case today that if most of the votes are predetermined by party affiliation, then some of this kind of goes away, right? And it's not all bad, because one thing that it might mean is that Doves have an easier time being themselves, right? It might mitigate the pressure on the Doves to go against type. A good example is the fact that despite what happened in Afghanistan and the drop in approval, Biden still got the Inflation Reduction Act passed. Why? Because it was going to be 51-49 and all come down to Joe Manchin no matter what happened, because that's just how legislation works today. So I think it depends on, I think it takes, if we're still highly polarized, it may not matter much who's going to be in office. because the Democrats won't be under quite as much pressure to intervene for the sake of kind of fighting for their own reputation. So, but what the outcome of the war is like, that's your department.
All right, any final calls before I wrap this up? We're at time, so I'm just standing because I missed some people before because I'm so short. All right, well, great. Then if everyone could just join me in thanking Elizabeth for her great talk. And thank you to everyone online for joining us too.
Thank you to the online folks. I don't know where I should be looking to.
From the heavens, they're looking at you.